lot of people will tell you that when it comes to Harley-Davidson, there's a certain feel, there's certain things that I like about Harley-Davidsons, and not all the time can they really articulate those things. But a lot of times they'll say that there's something about a Harley that just makes it more fun or more exciting, or a higher level of ownership, satisfaction, whatever it may be. A lot of times they can't articulate that. There's certain things that make a Harley different than other motorcycles in a lot of cases that, again, they can't always put it to words. But really, it really comes down to the look, the sound, and the feel of a Harley-Davidson that people enjoy. And so you might ask yourself, okay, well, that gets thrown around a lot. What exactly is that look, sound, and feel, and what is it about a Harley-Davidson that makes those traits unique to a Harley-Davidson? I think a lot of people will say that, yeah, the sound of a Harley is unique. You got that big thunderous V-twin rumble that screams American going down the road, and a lot of times people who aren't even involved in motorcycles or haven't even ridden Harleys will identify immediately, like, hey, that must be a Harley-Davidson. It's loud and it has that distinct V-twin sound. But I wanted to kind of touch for a minute and talk to you guys about what makes a Harley, and what makes it real distinct in its nature, both mechanically, aesthetically, and everything in between. So first off, I want to talk about sound. So the sound definitely comes from the architecture of the engine, right? So it's a 45-degree V-twin, air-cooled. It's got the single connecting pin, the connecting rods to the crank, and so it has a asymmetrical firing, basically, which kind of gives it that potato sound. And it's this engine architecture that Harley-Davidson has really stuck to for a long period of time, because it's the good and the bad of Harley-Davidson, right? It's what produces that sound and that character, using the push rod system as opposed to an overhead cam system. It's everything that makes up this V-twin that gives it that sound that you hear going down the road.
As Matt mentioned, the narrow firing, or the narrow V of the V-twin, is important to the specific characteristic of Harley. There's been a lot of manufacturers that will set out to build a competitor to a Harley-Davidson, and they'll look at the spreadsheet or the stats for whatever motor it is that they're competing with in whatever era. Most recently would have been the twin cam, or now the Milwaukee-Eight, and then they'll be like, okay, well, we can make improvements by not using a single pin crank, and then so you end up with, rather than both the cylinders being perfectly in line like they are on a Harley-Davidson, one being offset from the other, which might yield you certain efficiency gains, but they don't always factor in what was lost. And while we're talking mostly about sound at this point, it's little details like that Harley's always considering that affect everything about the bike that the other manufacturers, I think, don't always fully grasp, and then they'll change things. And as we talk more in this video, I think we're going to be going through things that Harley's been very resistant to change, and things that they have tried to change. And I think the consistent theme, as we discuss, is going to be Harley looking at what can we do without really manipulating either the sound or the look or the feel of the motor, but still offering more power, more reliability. How can we make it run cooler? What can we do to improve without really enacting any kind of change? And so the details that Matt pointed out about the motor, obviously those are all key components to it. And then you're going to notice that we didn't list everything. Even though some of the things do affect the way that the motor maybe feels or sounds a bit, they're able to change certain things. It's not like the Evo and the twin cam sound exactly alike. They don't. They have a very similar character, but there is a distinction between the two in a variety of ways, despite there being a pretty core architecture, or a core architecture shared pretty much between both of them. The Milwaukee-Eight's the same way. That doesn't sound exactly like a twin cam, but it still sounds very much like a Harley. It's something that always frustrates me when people say, oh, it sounds like a sewing machine. It's like they've all sounded like sewing machines when they're stock since the 80s. The sound regulations haven't changed since then. They've always been quiet. It's not until you put a set of pipes on them that they are really loud and start sounding like Harleys to most people. So all the things that give that traditional Harley sound have been maintained for many years now, and it's really only changes to the motor that don't affect that sound at its core that Harley's been willing to make. I mean, it's part of the reason why the Milwaukee-Eight exists in the current state that it does. It's a very unusual engine design by today's standards. There's not really anyone else making a motor even remotely similar to it. And the reason being is that Harley's engineering goals are not only about power and efficiency, they're also about maintaining that true Harley character.
Question that we get, or a comment I get a lot in the comment section on the YouTube videos, I really get this in person in real life, is, people will always throw out the criticism that, wow, Harley-Davidson has this old technology. Oh, pushrod technology. I remember when I launched my video when the Milwaukee-Eight first came out in the 2017 model year on the touring bikes. A lot of people, it was funny because I had both sides of the spectrum. I had a lot of people criticizing Harley-Davidson for not having newer technology. It's like, wow, Harley-Davidson doesn't know how to make a modern engine. But is that the case? We're going to get more into that in just a second. And then I had other people that were saying, oh, wow, it sounds like a Jap bike now. It sounds like a Japanese bike. It doesn't sound like a true Harley-Davidson. So the dilemma that Nick was talking about is creating an engine that kind of serves both of those customers. Somewhere in the middle. You got to have an engine that maintains that character that Harley-Davidson is known for. What people love about a Harley, that look, sound, and feel that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It maintains that look, sound, and feel of a Harley-Davidson, but it also incorporates modern technology into the bike to give it better reliability, better power, better performance, better comfort, in the way of heat mitigation and things like that. So it's all about striking a balance. And so as Nick said, the engineers, when they have to build a new big twin or any engine that goes inside a Harley-Davidson, the predicament that they're in is, how do we keep these core characteristics of the engine and the character of the engine while incorporating modern technology into the bike. And like Nick said, they have to meet certain criteria that other manufacturers and other vehicles, motorcycles and or cars don't have to meet.
Yeah, and that's some of the things that I was super excited when the Milwaukee-Eight was launched. I mean, I think most people are, if they're fans of the motor company, they're always going to be intrigued, interested, hopefully excited by whatever new motor comes out. It's not something that gets launched all the time. And what really struck me when the Milwaukee-Eight came out was not so much that it was outdated, because it depends on your perspective, but that's been, if you're just looking for the absolute cutting edge of what's going to be the most efficient and what's going to produce the most power, the idea that you would have been somehow satisfied with the twin cam and then disappointed with the Milwaukee-Eight is ridiculous to me, because the twin cam has the exact same issues, relative to its time period that the Milwaukee-Eight does. But that's only if you go into it thinking that the design parameters are, I'm going to make the most efficient engine possible, that's going to run the absolute coolest, it's going to make the absolute most power, and it's going to be the absolute most reliable thing on earth. If those are your only objectives, then the idea that you were somehow satisfied with the twin cam and now are disappointed with the Milwaukee-Eight, that never made sense to me. So what really struck me was just how unique of an engine it was. There's not really anything else like it. The idea that they've got a single cam doing 4 valves per cylinder is very unusual. The vast majority of pushrod motors that still exist today, of which there are many, mostly from American manufacturers like General Motors, and I know Chrysler's still producing their Hemi pushrod-based V8 architecture motors. Those are still all 2-valve designs, to my knowledge. When those manufacturers decide to go to 4 valves, they typically go to single overhead cam or dual overhead cam motors, which are some things that we're going to talk about later on in the video. But with Harley-Davidson, they went to that 4-valve design and they kept that pushrod architecture, because a big part of the reason for Harley-Davidson just existing at all is because of that core idea of what a Harley is.
So let's talk a little bit about liquid cooling. I feel like a lot of people equate liquid cooling to more of an advanced technology, which I would agree to that. But let's kind of talk about why Harley-Davidson hasn't incorporated liquid cooling into their signature big twin engine that comes on all their touring bikes and their Softails right now. Let's back up a little bit, actually. So let's talk about the V-Rod for a second. So the V-Rod came out in 2002 model year. For its time, and certainly still by today's standards, I think most people would agree that the technology and the architecture that makes the V-Rod power plant, people would agree that it is a technologically modern or advanced bike. Certainly advanced back in 2002, but I think even by today's standards, it's modern to say the very least. So that was a 60-degree full water jacket, liquid cooled bike, dual overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, higher revving engine, an engine that put out about 125 horsepower. So that was a bike that Harley-Davidson made and produced in collaboration with Porsche. And that was a bike that did well. It definitely had its niche within the Harley-Davidson customer network of who bought that. At this dealership, we probably sold about 1 or 2 a month for the time period that it lasted. It was discontinued halfway through the 2017 model year, and in 2018 they no longer had the V-Rod. But a very cool bike, but sales were okay. They weren't great. I would imagine, I'm just speculating here, that Harley-Davidson probably looked at it from a financial perspective and probably thought, okay, well, the V-Rod, we sell some, but it probably doesn't justify having the tooling and everything that goes along with building an entirely different bike than the big twin bikes. So they no longer have it. I feel like now there's a lot of focus on performance bikes, making these cruisers more performance oriented, which I think a lot of people may say is an oxymoron in and of itself, making a Harley or any cruiser for that matter a performance bike. That's kind of a whole different subject, but I think there's a big focus on making these cruisers perform better, and I think it's cool. I love it. In short, without going into it in a lot of detail, when it comes to a performance cruiser, a performance bagger, or any performance-oriented Harley-Davidson or any performance-oriented cruiser, it's everything that comes with a cruiser, or more specifically, we'll talk specifically about a Harley. It's everything that comes with a Harley-Davidson: the look, the sound, the feel, the comfort, the utility, all those things, and making it go fast. So that's kind of the segment or the niche that I see being filled by having a performance cruiser. A lot of people will say, well, for $10,000 you can buy an FZ09 or whatever and have way more horsepower and better power to weight ratio and everything else. But you're not going to have those other things that are unique to Harley-Davidson with that Yamaha or that inexpensive sport bike. So there is a place for performance cruisers. It's getting more and more as sought after, and the demand's getting higher for these types of bikes in the cruiser world that I'm seeing. And so then you say, okay, well, how do we make these things go faster? Well, liquid cooling, right? Once you introduce liquid cooling to an engine, now you're revving higher and you're going to be able to produce higher horsepower and bigger figures, right? So but everything has a trade-off, right? So what are the trade-offs of water cooling it, and why hasn't Harley-Davidson incorporated a water-cooled engine design on their bread and butter, their big twin engines that come, the Touring and the Softail family? Well, the trade-offs, you can start off with, the sound. You're no longer going to have the sound that comes from a air-cooled big twin engine anymore. So going back to what I said at the very beginning of the movie, what is it that people like about a Harley-Davidson? Well, the sound that it produces. It's a very distinct sound. I can't tell you how many times I had a customer come into the showroom floor. They said, oh, wow, this V-Rod looks amazing, and I hear good things about the performance. And I started up, and within 10 seconds, that person said, forget it. That's not a Harley. I don't want that bike because it's not a Harley. And then I have to correct them and say, well, it is a Harley, but it's not a air-cooled big twin Harley-Davidson, 45-degree, all the things I mentioned earlier. Then I start up a different Harley-Davidson, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's the Harley I want. So by going to a liquid cooling, you're taking away that character, that element of character in the sound of the bike. And you're also taking away other things like the cosmetics, which I'll get to in just a minute.
Usually when you start going down, the path of liquid cooling, you start going into a direction where you're probably going to start changing other things too that, as Matt said, are going to change the sound and the character of the motor overall. If you're doing that, you're probably going to start doing things like overhead cams. You're probably going to start doing all these other things that let you really take advantage of the liquid cooling to begin with, right? Because what that really allows is consistency in the combustion chamber. So obviously knowing the temperature at which the combustion cycle is going to occur lets you run tighter timings. It lets you know with more precision exactly what's going to be going on in that combustion chamber, and so you can just get everything closer to an ideal setup because you're going to maintain that temperature, regardless of exterior temperature, or at least within a much tighter range. And so knowing that ahead of time just lets you maximize a variety of different things. And as I said, one of those things being ignition timing, which, when you can run more aggressive timing, you can make more power. But like I said, usually to maximize those things, you're going to want to do things like, double overhead cams, variable valve timing, all these other things that really do start to change the character of the motor, the sound of the motor. because otherwise you've now changed the way that the motor looks. You've gone in a direction where now you don't have the fins, you don't have as much of the motor exposed, you've got to deal with putting a radiator on the front. So you've done all these compromises, right? And if you don't then also change the other portions of the motor, you've compromised for marginal gain. So usually when someone talks about doing water cooling on the bike, even though I guess technically I'm not sure what it would change sound-wise if you did a liquid-cooled motor exactly like the Milwaukee-Eight, it might sound pretty much identical, but you wouldn't really gain that much without incorporating other technologies to take advantage of that more consistent combustion chamber. So the reality is when you move in that direction, you kind of want to go all the way, or you kind of want to go all the way in the opposite direction like Harley has, where you maintain a very consistent architecture that lets you develop and maintain that very known character of the motor that honestly sells bikes. There's a lot of people that they want that look, that sound, that feel of the Harley, and as soon as you change that, as Matt mentioned, there's a niche market for it, but it's never going to be the majority market for Harley-Davidson, at least not for the foreseeable future. I'm sure at some point we'll start talking a little bit more about the upcoming bikes that Harley has developed in development, like the Pan America and the Street Fighter, which obviously are a significant break away from Harley's core product line today. But I think that that represents Harley understanding better the fact that if you're going to move away from that architecture that they currently have with the big air-cooled V-twin, that it can't be a half measure like I view the V-Rod as. The V-Rod was still very much a heavyweight cruiser. It just had a different power plant, whereas those bikes are not. They're not a half step. They're a full step into a totally different motorcycle market. And I think that's really the smart way to do it, because most of the other manufacturers have built, as I was talking about, those half-measure bikes. They've looked at what Harley has done and like, okay, well, we're going to offer more performance, but then the motor loses the character that the Harley has, or we're going to make the bike lighter, and so they use an aluminum frame, but they don't realize that chunky aluminum frame hides more of the motor, and that it just doesn't have the visual appeal of the steel perimeter frame that we're all used to on a Harley. So there's little changes like that I think sometimes the manufacturers are a little short-sighted when they try to compete with Harley. And then even when Harley themselves went to liquid cooling, they kind of did a half measure. As much as I like the V-Rod, because I do like performance things, I do like things that are a little bit different and a little out of the box. To me, it was always kind of a half measure. It was a sport bike style motor in a heavyweight cruiser frame. So for me, it's like the opposite of what I want. If I'm going to go all the way, I want to go all the way. I want something that's going to be really light, really rev happy if I'm going to go with a sport bike. Otherwise, if I want a cruiser, I've already kind of acknowledged that I'm looking at what I've always compared and talked about people as almost like a classic car that's just been made more reliable, more powerful than it would have been 50 years ago, but in that same style. No one freaks out when someone goes out and buys a 69 Chevelle. They're not like, oh my God, you bought this thing? You could have gone somewhere else and gotten a faster car for less money that's going to be more reliable. It's like you've missed the point entirely. It's this classic look, this classic style, this classic sound that I'm after. And no one then freaks out too when guys go and start modifying their classic cars and building resto mods, and making them faster. Are they going to be as faster as the fastest sports cars? Of course not, but that's not the point. Once again, you've missed the point entirely. I want a look, a sound, a feel. And so that's what Harley's kind of represented to me. They're a manufacturer that's decided to, hey, we're going to try to achieve this look, sound, feel, but we're also going to try to make the bike better slowly where we can, without compromising those core things. So the new bikes are really a massive departure from that, because those bikes are going to abandon the classic look and feel and sound of a Harley, which in many ways will be good, because that does offer a lot of advantages. But in other ways, it's going to be, they're not going to have that classic character. So if that's what you're after, those bikes are not going to appeal to you. But of course, Harley's not getting rid of the other bikes as well. So they're just going to maintain a wider variety of bikes, which I think is good for everybody who likes Harley-Davidsons, because it's more things to choose from.
One thing I want to add too is, we talk about the character that the big twin delivers, and it's put in a cruiser. The segment of motorcycle is a cruiser, and we're definitely going to segment to the Bronx, the Street Fighter, and the Pan America, which is the adventure bike that Harley-Davidson's coming out with here pretty soon. A lot of people, when it comes to a cruiser, they want certain elements of a cruiser. And even other manufacturers other than Harley-Davidson, like BMW is coming out with an opposing twin bike that's coming out here pretty soon that I've seen pictures of. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a very raw bike where it's very simplistic. Everything is kind of taken down to just the minimalist or the essentials of what makes a bike a bike. The engine is on full display, and everything is just very clean lines. And that's what Harley-Davidson does. That's what Harley-Davidson goes for. And so the engine, the air-cooled engine that Harley-Davidson makes, the big twin, the character of the engine and everything it does is kind of, it's very conducive to what people like in a cruiser. They like that raw, stripped-down look. You can see the engine. It's not covered by shrouds of plastic. You can see the detail in it, the pushrod tubes. You can see the engine working. You have a very mechanical, visceral feel to the engine as well. And like Nick touched on as well, you have kind of that neoclassic feel and look of the bike as well. It goes for the classic look, but you have modern technology incorporated into it, which is kind of another criticism that I get a lot on my YouTube channel and in the comments. Is people say, wow, there's some of these other things that other manufacturers that add to the bike technology wise. Maybe it's a windshield that goes up and down, which I hope for the love of all that is holy, Harley-Davidson never does that on their cruisers, because a windshield that goes up and down electronically is just hideous, and putting the weight of the motor in there and the fairing and making it more bloated, it kills the lines and the look of that really clean looking cruiser bike. And we're going to get into the look here in just a second, but the look of Harley-Davidson, they maintain that by not incorporating technology into the bike where it's going to take away from that real clean classic look. Things like radiators, like Nick mentioned, they try to avoid that when they can, and extra wiring and weld marks and things like that, they try to hide those things. There's very little wiring showing on Harley-Davidson's big twin. Extra plastics or paint, shrouds, they try to eliminate that so the engine is on full display, which is a trait in a cruiser that a lot of people like and appreciate. They want that raw engine to be exposed there. Let's talk a little bit about the Bronx and the Pan America, the adventure bike that Harley-Davidson is going to be coming out with in the next model year, in the 2021 model year. So these are two completely different bike types, motorcycle types and segments that Harley-Davidson's going to be getting into, the adventure bike and the street fighter. These are two motorcycles that I'm perfectly fine with them going to a water-cooled engine, which if they didn't, actually, I would raise an eyebrow at that. But these are two motorcycle types where the riders have different priorities. They no longer have the priority of the character and the feel of a Harley-Davidson the way we've known a Harley-Davidson. Now it's more about weight and performance and being an off-road capable bike while also having on-road capabilities as well. So when the engineers go to the table to make the Revolution Max is what they're calling the engine, which is kind of a derivative of the V-Rod engine, whole new engine, but it's the same architecture basically. They've gone to the table, it's a different application now, so they can go to a different engine type, where an engine like this isn't going to be applicable or is not going to be a good application in their core cruiser motorcycles. It is a good application in these motorcycles for the off-road and the street fighter. Let's talk on the look a little bit more. So we've kind of talked about the sound quite a bit, so let's talk about the look. And I've talked a little bit about the look of the engine and having that raw engine look where you can see the mechanicalness and just kind of the raw bones of the engine and what makes up the engine, the heads, the cylinder, the intake, the cam chest, all that stuff. And so people just love the beauty of raw mechanical engines. And other than that, you've got things like the paint on a Harley-Davidson. The paint from Harley-Davidson factory is, when you compare it to other manufacturers that mass-produce motorcycles, Harley's the best by far. And they do that. If you've ever been to their facility, just the detail and the care they put into their paint, and just the fact that they have a really thick, it's a 3 mil clear coat on their paint. There's a lot of things that go into making that paint look really nice and also last a long time as well. There's a lot of things that go into what makes a Harley-Davidson hold its value as well, and just the quality of parts that go into the bike, which people appreciate in a cruiser. You're not going to put the most expensive paint in the world on adventure bike or an expensive light sport bike either. It's very applicable to a cruiser, which again, it kind of goes back to why Harley does what they do, because of the motorcycle segment that they're in, the cruiser, heavy cruiser segment. So the paint, the chrome, the way they hide all their welds, all their electrical, they don't incorporate unnecessary technology into the bike to make it more bloated, have more moving parts, take away from the really sleek classic design. And so everything's very methodical. Things like, I remember when ABS first came out. When it first came out, it was actually in the 2007 police bikes. Well, they had this huge big police or ABS module in the saddlebag that took up about 25% of the saddlebag. And they did it on the police bikes because aesthetics weren't as important as the regular civilian bikes. But eventually they were able to reduce the size of the ABS module and put it on there very clean, so it didn't take away the aesthetics of it. And now you can barely even notice that there is ABS on these bikes anymore. So as technology improves and they can incorporate the technology into the bike in a way that it's not going to take away from the real classic looking lines. I mean, to the untrained eye, I've had people mistake, a very untrained eye, I should say. I've had people mistake a brand new 2017 Harley-Davidson for something that was like a 1995. A lot of people, once again, untrained people that don't know what they're looking at, mistake even the older bikes for newer bikes and vice versa, because Harley does so well at that really simple, classic look in their bikes.
And it's it's easy to say that Harley's paint is great paint, but and people will look at it and they'll go, okay, yeah, that looks nice. But one of the things that examples that I always point to for telling how nice paint is, or how much money was spent on a particular paint job from the factory. One of the easy things you can do is to kind of look at how decals are potentially applied, or how the layers of the paint are applied. Because there's expensive ways that look better, and then there's less expensive ways that are cheaper but don't look as nice, at least if you're looking carefully. Like with the least expensive being, you paint the tank your color. If you wanted to do a different color on there, you apply decals to get to that color. It's a vinyl decal on there, and then now you've got a two-tone paint. So that's very common on like sport bikes. You'll have they'll spray the tank one color, and then they'll apply vinyl decals over the top of that, and they usually won't even apply clear coat after that, so you can actually see the edges of what is basically a sticker on the tank, and that keeps costs down. And from 5 feet, 10 feet away, you probably wouldn't notice, and it's not a problem. But things, when you start looking up close, you'll notice that just doesn't look as nice. It doesn't have the impact that you would expect. If you go to a Sportster, you can't see any layers in the paint. It just looks like a perfectly smooth glass surface over what either has to be multiple layers of paint or a vinyl decal that they then sprayed clear coat over. But regardless, they took the time to put enough layers of clear on there, which is more expensive than not doing that, of course, because they're so committed to that very high quality fit and finish. And so that's a long explanation for a relatively small detail that most people won't notice. But it just frustrates me when I see people saying, oh, these are just overpriced things and Harley's asking a bunch of money because of the name. But it's like, maybe you're just not looking close enough. Maybe you just don't appreciate those things, and that's fine. But those are things that really bug me when I see it on a bike. If I'm going to go spend money on something and it just has a sticker on the tank, that bugs me. And we get bikes in on trade, and even from manufacturers that charge a lot of money, I'll see things like that. And maybe it's just because I notice it, and maybe it's just something, well, once you see it, you can't unsee it. But it's definitely something that costs more money. So you definitely have to acknowledge that build quality, whether it matters to you or not.
So something I'll point out too is a lot of these things that we're talking about don't really show up on stat sheets. So I feel like in the age of the internet that we're on now, where anybody can just pull up their cell phone and just look up a bike and kind of compare stats, and you're talking about price, horsepower, the weight, those key stats, which are certainly very important, don't get me wrong, but Harley-Davidsons, they're terrible stat bikes. You don't buy a Harley-Davidson to brag to your buddy that you got better stats than them. Now, where they do excel are some of these things that we're talking about. Things that Nick mentioned, as far as the looks, the appeal, the quality, the craftsmanship, the resale value. There's something to be said about resale value. Really, a bike doesn't get, or any vehicle in the world doesn't get resale value unless the style and the appeal is right and the quality is there. Very rarely do things that have poor quality have good resale value. Or, I mean, there's a million classic Harley-Davidson builders as well. If those parts and that style wasn't right, people wouldn't be going back and buying knuckle pan shovel heads. We wouldn't have Born Free, where people were building these classic Harley-Davidsons and showing them off. And that's because the architecture is beautiful and because the parts are high quality. There's something to be said for having a quality motorcycle, especially where it's appreciated in a cruiser, because again, a cruiser is the right type of bike to apply those types of finishes and build quality and detail to. Let's talk a little bit about the feel. So the feel is the last one. We've talked about the sound and the looks, and now let's talk about the feel a little bit. And I want to start this off just by saying that it's been interesting for me to see in the last 5 years how Harley-Davidson has been putting a lot more emphasis on test rides. I think that they're recognizing that for a Harley-Davidson to be fully appreciated, you got to see it, you got to ride it, and you got to experience it. I've ridden a lot of bikes in my lifetime, dirt bikes. I'm a huge off-road enthusiast. I ride less now than I used to, but I still like to get out there, and I still, really enjoy off-road riding. And, I've ridden, plenty of sport bikes. I've never owned one, but just, bikes that we get in here, I've ridden a whole bunch of them. I have the most fun on a Harley. I'm going down the same road as a lot of these other bikes you can go down, with the exception of the off-road bikes. But there's just something about the feel of a Harley-Davidson that people just love. It really is a bike that can connect a human to a machine, on a visceral level more than any bike out there, except for maybe if you're building some, classic, bobber or classic Harley or something like that. But just the mechanical feel that Harley-Davidson purposefully leaves in their Milwaukee-Eight or twin cam engine is something that, unless you experience it, you don't really fully appreciate it. There's just something about starting up that Harley, getting connected to that raw mechanical piece of machinery, there's just something that's very fun about it. Harley knows that. They like people to come down to the dealership to actually ride the bike, and once people ride the bike, it's amazing how people just, they light up and they just can recognize, okay, I get it now. This is why Harley does what they do. There's more to a motorcycle. There's more to the enjoyment of a motorcycle than, putting up the highest horsepower number, especially when you're riding a cruiser. We're not taking these things out to the racetrack here. But things like the Milwaukee-Eight, on the Softails, they reduced the primary shaking forces by 100%. They added an additional counterbalancer in the engine. That's because the engine is hard mounted to the frame, so it's a little bit different animal than the touring bike. But the touring bikes, they purposefully left. They say, according to their statistics, they reduced the primary shaking forces by 75%. So they purposefully left an element of that mechanical vibration feel to the motorcycle. Now, when you get up to speed, that all levels off. It's rubber mounted, and these bikes are extremely smooth, even at high speeds, especially the touring bikes. But you still have that feeling of mechanicalness to the bike that I really appreciate.
So as Matt was mentioning, it's one of those things where I think people don't always think about it when it comes to Harleys, but they acknowledge it in a variety of markets within the motorcycle community. That the spec sheet's not always the most important thing. In fact, it's almost never the most important thing. And most people will choose a bike that is more fun rather than one that is faster. And we all have things that excite us about bikes. And for many of us, it's like the mechanical nature, the mechanical connection that we have with a bike. The way that the transmission engages, the way the clutch feels, the sound that the bike makes. Those are all things that are going to contribute to a different engagement with the bike. How does the bike respond in the middle of the corner? Is it transition side to side, very quickly? That's another thing. Maybe someone wants the lightest, the most responsive bike. That might be what really makes you feel connected to a bike. But for many of us, it's not about the spec sheet. It's about how do we feel when we ride the bike, and that leads us to designs that are not always the most efficient. I have, as Matt's owned a lot of dirt bikes, I spent a lot of time on street bikes. I've had my first bike was a Buell 1125R. Which I love to take on twisty roads. If you go back and you watch the road trip that Matt and some of the other Laidlaw guys took out to Death Valley, I did that on the 1125R before I started working here. And that bike was not a spec machine, so it didn't make the most power in the sport bike world because it was a V twin, and they'd never rev as high as the inline fours, which make more peak power, but it made more torque, and the sound was just, it didn't sound like a Harley, but it had this incredibly unique sound to it, and it had this character that I loved. And even though there were faster sport bikes out there, I wouldn't have chosen to have any of them because I liked the character of that Buell. And for me, it's the same thing with Harleys. I'd rather be going up the canyon road on an 85, my father's 1985 FXR, than I would be on my track bike, because at street speeds, I'd rather have the bike with more character. I'd rather have the bike that I feel more mechanically engaged to, because I'm not trying to push the absolute limits of my riding skills. I'm trying to just have a nice ride on a windy canyon road. So Harley's been very dedicated to making sure that the bikes are not necessarily mechanical, absolute efficient, in terms of their design, because the vast majority of us don't want that. And the manufacturers that people lust after, like Harley-Davidson and like most of the Italian manufacturers that people talk about as having this passion and that kind of stuff, they're never going for that most efficient design. They're going for the thing that stirs the soul the most. And I think Harley-Davidson does that potentially better than anybody else in the field, especially for Americans, because I think it's a very culturally significant brand to many of us, and it's an iconic brand that we all know the look and the sound and the feel of a Harley. If we're into motorcycles and we're Americans, we know those things. I think that the brands that we identify strongly with and that really develop the strongest communities around are those brands that produce things that not necessarily represent the best spec sheet, but ones that really tie you and bring you in an emotional level, and that you interface with that product on a different level than just, oh, this is a good thing that is reliable and fast and it works and it does exactly what I tell it to do. Those are all nice features to have, but those aren't things that really usually for people build an emotional connection with the machine.
For as long as I've been involved with Harley-Davidson, I've always heard Harley owners say things and phrases like, if I had to explain it, you wouldn't understand. And I just love the look, sound, and feel of my Harley-Davidson. And these phrases, although I feel like they're true to me. They don't really explain to maybe someone new to the motorcycle world or new to the Harley world exactly what it is about the look, sound, and feel that is appealing to people. So this is mine and Nick's attempt to really put into words what it is exactly about the look, sound, and feel of a Harley-Davidson that is so appealing to so many people. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Let me know in the comment section below if you agree with some of the stuff. Maybe I left some stuff out. If there's some things you want to add, please let me know. And if you disagree with me, I'd like to hear that as well. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Take care. Enjoy. Bye-bye.